So as we've just heard from Paul Dwyer there is plenty to talk about when it comes to the threat actors. But when it comes to those who are defending against them on a daily basis here in the country, there's probably no four better people to talk to than the people on this stage now. We have Michael Kelly, who's the Head of Operations at ECAS BT Ireland, Mary Kennedy, European Cybersecurity and Information Services Lead at Arup, Katie McCarthy, Head of Cybersecurity at Irish Water, and Richard Brown, the Director of the National Cybersecurity Centre. And Richard, as ever, I'm going to start with you, just because...
Why not?
Why not? So we spoke recently, because this is EU Cybersecurity Month, and one of the things that you said to me was that these cyber threats have been around for quite a while. Methods may have evolved and so on, but the threats have been around. So how much of what we're seeing, what we're hearing, and what you guys are defending against is new? Is there anything that you kind of sit back going, this is something that we haven't seen before?
So simple answer to this, and to confirm, I mean, cybersecurity threats of the type we deal with have been around for at least 20 years. And if you believe the rumour mill, there were significant cyber attacks in the 1980s, which is quite a trick. But I suppose the important thing is the industry is always changing and the threat vectors are always changing. The actors don't change that quickly, but they do change. So if you divide it into the three types of groups we deal with, and I went through it on the podcast, on the nation state side, the groups tend to change more slowly because they're government entities. They're civil servants, basically, or military officers. So those change in a slightly more organic, slower fashion. If you look at the criminal actors, they can change very, very quickly. And they can bounce between IOCs, between methodologies, between TTPs very quickly. They find a new toy, they'll use it that day if they can. And then the hacktivists and the script kiddies are much more fluid. I suppose from our perspective, the price of security is eternal vigilance. And vigilance in this context is not a static thing, it's a dynamic thing. Threat intelligence, understanding what the bad guys are doing, understanding who your bad guys are most likely to be if you're a significant company like the entities here, is really critical. Mm-hmm. It can't be just about this is what's happening. It's these are the people who are interested in me and what do I need to do to defend against these people. Yeah. We've done a lot of work with the financial services sector here on exactly this model, trying to understand who the most likely entities are to come after the financial services sector, for example.
Mm-hmm. And we're going to hear from our other panellists, but I just want to clarify for everyone in the room who may not be as familiar with the National Cybersecurity Centre as others. When something big arises, does the National Cybersecurity Centre try to figure out the why of the question, or is it just a case of we need to shut this down and get it fixed ASAP?
So it's a horrible cliche at this point, but we take everything from the ones and zeros to the Taoiseach's desk. So you do everything from the forensic technical analysis. We manage and coordinate the national incident response regardless of the scale of the incident. Everything from an everyday incident to something like the HSE. And then we deal with the political and geopolitical aftermath, working with our colleagues in Department of Foreign Affairs, Department of Taoiseach, the Defence Forces, the Gardaí, and so on. So we do everything. Subtext, there's a national strategy on managing major emergencies called the Major Emergency Management Strategy, helpfully. And that piece basically sets out how lead government departments manage each major emergency type, everything from flooding to foul weather to whatever. Cyber is us, and we do everything from the start to the very end.
Okay, and we might talk through the types of threats in just a quick moment. But Michael, if I want to come to you now, because an organisation like BT has been around for quite a while, has been at the forefront of the development of a lot of technology that people are using. There's legacy, there's clout, there's all of those things there. Has your model for defending against cyber threats evolved as the rate of the technology that we'd all use has grown as well?
Yes, is the short answer. I mean, really BT has been in this area for decades. But I think where it really came into the modern age was in the 2012 Olympics, when, if everybody remembers, the UK hosted the Olympics itself. And that was certainly the first time I was aware that there was such a huge emphasis on an amount of cyber attacks. And BT was asked by the UK government to take that on and to defend the entire infrastructure, to build it and defend it then and operate it for the 5 or 6 weeks, whatever it was. So I think that's really the evolution. But you know, the other thing that BT has done is recruit about 3,000 security professionals. Because even in my day job, there's no way that we could recruit and retain that level of expertise. As a relatively small organisation, we need to rely on teams or panels of experts. And really learn from the best.
Okay, and I want to come back to the London story in just a quick moment, but I want to bring Katie in, because Katie, everybody will know Irish Water, they will know the body that it is. How much communication and collaboration goes on with other bodies like that in terms of your cyber defence strategy?
So I suppose on that, there's quite a lot of, I'd say, organisational groups that are set up to facilitate knowledge sharing between utilities and also between other bodies in Ireland and in Europe as well. So there's quite an open dialogue going on a regular basis where we're keeping each other updated and informed on what we're seeing in the wild, what are the different threat actors and what are the different types of attacks and potential attacks that we're seeing across the board. And that's so key into building our own knowledge and looking at building our strategy, because as I'm sure a lot of people in the room are aware, you have a strategy and you're constantly pivoting. So there's pivoting to put out fires, there's pivoting to try and address immediate concerns that are being seen in the wild. And it's keeping your finger on that pulse to try and understand, where am I best going to put my investment, both my time, my people, my resources, where's the best place to put that to make sure that we're getting the right outcome, that we're properly defending our assets and our processes.
And Mary, to bring you in here, I suppose every organisation should, and fingers crossed does, have their own approach to cybersecurity and cyber threats. But if the pandemic taught us anything, it's that you have to open your doors to new ways of working, new tools, new programs. Collaboration is key. So you could have your house in order, but you could invite somebody in who doesn't. How aware do leaders need to be of, what programs they're utilising and the security and the legitimacy, I suppose, of new tools that may be great for productivity, but not so good for security?
Yeah, so we are working with lots of different organisations, from transport to energy and so on. And they cannot do that. They cannot provide their services in isolation. In many cases, they are seeking support for their services from other organisations through services and tools. So they're using data by and large to drive efficiencies within their own organisation. Sharing this data, whether it be with a third party or using a third party tool within their organisation, all of a sudden opens up the floodgates and potentially puts a weakness within their own security mechanisms. So we work with a lot of organisations to ensure that their supply chain management is in place from the very start of an engagement, setting expectations either through a tender engagement through to an ongoing oversight and governance programs are key to ensuring that every level of your service has security protection included.
Michael, to go back to that example of London, and maybe you can't go into too much detail on that particular case, but in that type of instance, when you are looking to defend on a massive scale against cyber threats, what gets protected first? That question of, if your house is on fire, what's the one thing you'd save? When you're trying to defend an entire country that's on a global scale, what's the, I suppose, numeric approach to the priorities?
Well, I'll be honest, it wasn't that approach. It was actually, when supply chain management was mentioned there, the very first thing that BT decided to do was, let's build the infrastructure afresh. Let's not import anything that already exists. The easiest way to secure the infrastructure that's required is to build it from the ground up with security in mind. So that's what they did. And I mean, in working with a lot of supply chain partners, but you can imagine the obvious, networking providers. They set about how would they come up with the optimal design that had security built in from the ground up, and that's what actually worked. It was far easier to secure a brand new, fresh infrastructure that had been built from with security in mind, then try and incorporate lots of existing domains and make that work. So that was the approach, to be honest, rather than a prioritizing of various pieces.
I'm sure that sounds like your dream, Richard, to have everything built with security from the ground up into the DNA, ingrained so nothing could possibly go wrong. But we know that's not the reality. And I think the HSE ransomware attack, and that's the first time I've mentioned it today, so I'm proud of myself, but the HSE ransomware attack was obviously a very famous example that showcased the domino effect that targeting a health service can have. You know, babies couldn't be registered when they were born, people missed out on appointments, there was a whole host of human consequences to that. When your office looks at the prevention of something like the HSE for systems that are legacy, you know, they're not built with security in mind, how do you approach that? And is it a case of when or if rather than when?
To some extent, yes. But to go back, I suppose one of the fundamental challenges we face is that cybersecurity, one of the more interesting elements of it is that infrastructure is privatized. And the state can no longer defend it aside from the infrastructure. It has to be defended on the infrastructure. So previously, you could put an anti-aircraft gun over a factory and that would provide a nominal degree of defense. You can't do that in cyber. And secondly, as you say, there's a wide disparity in the types of or the degree of readiness across different organisations. The mention was made earlier on of the type of technological debt that the HSE say they have with regard to their own infrastructure. 600 plus million was mentioned. Those are real issues and that you can't ignore them. They're real practical issues. But similarly, the function of the organisation is not to be cyber secure. The function of the HSE is to provide healthcare services to the people of the state. So, you know, if we went in and with a sledgehammer and say, right, spend €1 billion now, well, A, technically you can't do it. And B, you'd shut down the health service. And that's not the reason why we have a health service. So we have to work with the reality we face progressively and over time, using, and in our case, and I won't mention anybody else on the panel, we have a set of compliance roles under the EU NIS directive since 2018, which gives us a series of statutory powers to engage with and essentially compel people to do things, which we use responsibly and in a progressive fashion. So people build towards compliance. And that building towards compliance model is at the very heart of our entire compliance model across not just the OAS, the Operators of Essential Services under NIS, the DSPs under NIS, but also everything else we do. So the material we produce for Cybersecurity Month, again, focuses again on exactly that model, that you build progressively towards compliance, focusing first of all on the things that are most critical, your data sets, your perimeter, and then building towards a more mature security model across your organisation, regardless of your scale.
And Katie, that all sounds, and we all, maybe you are all these people, so I don't mean any offence, but we all know that feeling when the IT person comes up to you in the office and tries to explain the importance of cybersecurity or why there's a firewall or why this, that and the other is in place. How important is it to articulate to your team in a way that they understand, that's not jargon and it doesn't go over their head, that they can digest it, so that they are almost part of that first line of defence?
It's quite difficult depending on the area that you're speaking about, but it's actually probably one of the most important jobs that you have as a cyber professional, because the people in the room here are not the people who need to be educated on cybersecurity. It's the end users. And depending on what part of the company you're in, cybersecurity and the risks to that area are very, very different. And in order to, I suppose, bring across the idea that cybersecurity is everyone's responsibility, you are our first line of defence. It's trying to have a dialogue with them around what is a threat to your function, to the kind of processes that you're carrying out. What does bad look like? And then what way are we looking at to try and defend that, and what can we do to put that into practice? Because in a lot of cases, cybersecurity is seen as an IT problem. Cybersecurity is seen as, that's the cybersecurity team over there. And I suppose one of the great things about the NIS directive is that it very firmly calls in your HR protections, it calls in your supply chain, your procurement protections. And it's really making the entire organisation stand up and say, actually, this is our problem. I can't just hand it off to the team over here on the left because, you know, that's not my job. So it's really good in making cybersecurity everyone's responsibility.
Richard?
Just to follow on from that, I think, as was just said, cybersecurity often engages with structural problems in organizations. And if the structures aren't right, then cyber cannot be right in a fully mature way. And one of the things and challenges we face over time, and it's getting much better now, is trying to get organizations to engage with and understand this as a fully societal, cultural, company-wide problem. And it's happening. The other thing to keep in mind also is NIS2 is even more expansive on the particular role of boards and the role of management of organizations, and has for the first time puts specific obligations on boards and the senior management of organizations around cybersecurity. That's one fundamental issue. The other fundamental issue, which is much more difficult to address, is supply chain, but we can go back to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Mary, one of the things that has come up quite a lot anytime I scratch the surface on cybersecurity is the importance of collaboration. So whether that is the internal collaboration that Katie just spoke about there, or with other bodies. So whether that is other companies such as yours, whether it is the National Cybersecurity Centre or the Gardaí, how important is that collaboration and that open dialogue and the sort of lack of fear to say we might have done something here, we need help?
You could say that maybe 10, 15 years ago, certainly cyber attacks were happening, but nobody was talking about it. I mean, it was an absolute taboo subject. The fact that we have so many people here in the room today demonstrates the need for that dialogue. One person starts to talk, and then all of a sudden other people overhear it and go, oh my God, I had an issue like that. Or even if they didn't have an issue like that, they go back, they take something back to their own organisation and they say, oh God, I must check our awareness programme, or I must check our procurement, I must check our contracts because of something they may have heard within this room. So when people come to us as, a consultancy firm, we bring together the different experiences of all the different organisations we are working. And while we don't divulge the exact, situations, we can give a sense and adapt our own approaches to the service that we give out to operators of critical infrastructure, IT organisations and so on. So it is that it's making the room and the dialogue a lot smaller and a lot more intimate, as opposed to the unknown that sometimes, Paul was talking earlier, we saw, pictures and videos there that none of us were aware of, but now we're going back to our organisations with that little bit more information going, oh my God, this is not just talk, this is reality. Yeah. So it is that, it's about that taking the sting out of it. We're all in the same boat. Yeah, absolutely. And we're also in the EU as well, which I think is a benefit when you look across the emphasis that's been made on the importance of cybersecurity, the dialogue, the open dialogue that seems to be in place within Europe, but then also around the world. Michael, is that something that you've encountered, that there is that open conversation and there is that willingness to communicate? Because at the end of the day, nobody wants to see another organisation go through a cyber attack, let alone go through it themselves.
No, absolutely. And it's embarrassing apart from anything else, not to mention destructive to the organisation. And it's a huge cost because, as Paul outlined earlier, in actual fact, we'd certainly prefer to see the spend earlier rather than trying to solve the problem. I think the other thing is, yes, there's no doubt that there's a big EU push behind this, and they're putting the money where their mouth is. But I think what has also changed in the last year and a half or two is that, as previous speakers have said, there's a realisation now that cybersecurity is everybody's issue. Certainly it was an IT problem, I suppose, 4 or 5 years ago. And what I would say is, it needs to permeate through the entire organisation. Everybody needs to have at least a basic awareness of it. What we do is that we train every man and woman in the organisation, because in all, to be frank about it, probably our biggest fear is that somebody will click on an email. Mm-hmm. Now we have things that I won't talk about, but things that we will do to defend that from an infrastructure perspective. But we need to get people into the mindset that whatever the role is, even if they're not IT connected or not connected to the IT organisation, maybe they use the barest minimum amount of IT within their organisation, that they can still be the cause, if they perform the wrong action, they can be the cause of bringing down the entire organisation.
Yeah, and I think that's something that people have become much more aware. I know when I'm talking about on News Talk, the amount of people who tweet me screenshots going, is this a legit text from my bank? And it's clearly not, but it's great that people are asking the question and have the confidence to ask the question, because I think that's part of prevention. Richard, you mentioned that you deal with sort of from the bottom right up to the Taoiseach's desk. When you're engaging with government on issues, particularly in the wake of the ransomware attack, is the appetite and the understanding there to ensure that you're confident that everybody in the room, everybody around the table gets what we're going after here, and that is to stay protected?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I suppose to keep in mind, the HSE was the first very public cybersecurity incident we have in the state. We deal with several thousand incidents every year, and we have done since 2011. And the NCSC was founded essentially bringing together several pre-existing functions in 2011, but it goes back much further than that. So the state has 20 years of experience of dealing with cybersecurity incidents of various different types. And the systems and processes we use to deal with them, both technically and administratively and politically, have matured over time as well. We have NSAC in the Department of the Taoiseach now, which deals with coordinating all of these national security issues, including the hybrid threat type question. Hybrid threat, not warfare question, which is obviously material. And also keep in mind the Gardaí, and I see Pat is here, have also expanded dramatically in terms of their capabilities in terms of responding to cyber crime on the ground, including regional cyber hubs, which gives people a much more approachable local access route to resolution on lots of these issues. Just really quickly to come back to something else on phishing. So phishing remains obviously one of the major vectors for attacks, but it's falling in terms of its relevance. More than 10% fewer attacks last year, according to some of the vendor reports we've seen, were from phishing. What's becoming more and more of a concern is supply chain-based attacks and people using long-standing extant vulnerabilities. So the patching regime, the cybersecurity maturity regime you have in your organization is becoming even more critical, because phishing is becoming less attractive to the attacker because people are better at A, spotting it, and B, the types of attacks you can launch via phishing are starting to become less effective thanks to advances in antivirus and other software providers.
Okay, well, I suppose part of that is good to hear. Mary, from a structural point of view, from an organisational point of view, and from an infrastructure point of view, how much time should be spent monitoring and training? And, you know, because in medicine they always say the prevention is better than the cure. I assume that's the same thing when it comes to cybersecurity. You want to do drills and try to catch things and the ethical hacking and all the rest as much as possible, so that you're getting ahead of something rather than catching up 2 months later.
Well, I mean, you talk about, was it training, making people aware. Your employees are your biggest threat. People are your biggest threat within your organisation. And if they're not, much like what Katie said, if they're not aware of the impact that they can have, well, then you're on a hiding to nothing. So placing a focus in that area is important. Not only your employees, but talking about the supply chain again, informing and making aware third-party contractors, even contractors you have coming in yourself, service providers may be around. Like we have seen over the past, you know, building management systems provided by third parties have in the past been, you know, the entry door into large organisations. We've seen people like, you know, organisations like Google coming under attack because of the building management system. This was down in Australia at one stage. So the smallest chink in that chain exposes you completely. So the awareness from the very start, even at contract, so at tender stage, then the whole way through, as I've said, we have to keep this on the table. So there's no set amount of time that you should or should not spend. Keep getting the message out, keep talking about it.
Okay, I see a question has come in on Slido. A quick reminder, you can go to sli.do and put in Cyber Summit 22. If Conti HSE attack will cost 658 million, is that an indication of how much the HSE should have spent to protect itself? That's from Richard Brown. Rupert Brown for Richard Brown.
Hello, cousin. So I suppose the simple answer is no, or kind of. First of all, the HSE attack, the incident itself was entirely preventable. So there was nothing to say that it couldn't have been stopped. There were several different occasions in that process where it should have been stopped. The systems and processes were in place, they just didn't work properly, which is a whole cultural question that we're still all struggling with, I think. The second thing is that's what's known as the technological debt. That's HSE's estimate of what it needs to spend to be resistant to those types of attacks in the future. To be fair, they've made huge strides already, and they've spent a lot of money. They've engaged a lot of new contractors which have provided them with a range of much more advanced services in some of these areas. But that kind of technological debt question continues to exist in lots of organisations. It's difficult to say whether that's an accurate figure, because if you were to structurally change how the organisation works, maybe it would be less. So these are figures that are really contingent on how the organisation wants to defend itself as a whole. To go back to something else really quickly on the idea of your staff being your biggest threat, I actually disagree. I think that's actually very close to victim blaming. In many cases, the organisation has responsibility for its own networks. If someone clicking on a link can easily lead to the organisation falling apart, it's not the person's fault, it's the organisation's fault. And this is really fundamental. People, no matter how good the training, no matter how good the cyber hygiene training, somebody in a larger organisation is always going to click on the link. I've been doing this a long time, and I've seen lots of phishing emails I would have clicked on. So you can't blame the user, ultimately. It's the organisation's responsibility to defend itself.
Yeah, you pointed out Pat Ryan of the Garda National Cybercrime Bureau, who's going to be on one of our panels later on, and we're going to talk about the issue of underreporting of cyber crimes, because that is an issue, and it is to do, as Michael, you mentioned, the shame and the embarrassment and the potential reputational damage. Do you think we are doing enough to educate everybody in the room when it comes to cyber attacks, not only when it comes to critical infrastructure, but also on a day-to-day basis? Because I often get emails from people saying, I'm not that tech savvy, but they'll have a smartphone, a leap card and a debit card.
Sure.
That's a big enough window to get through. So what more, or do we need to do more firstly, and what more could we do?
Yeah, I would like, well, certainly within organisations, there's a big job there to not only to educate people, but to continue to educate people, because as Richard rightly said, the game keeps moving on. So, you know, the threat level for various actors or actions is going to rise and fall. So we need to overcome that. I think it's great, like through your own offices and so on, Jess, that, you know, there is much more of a national conversation about these things. You know, people in all walks of life are now talking about it. But I think the other thing that possibly we could do, and maybe it's through the EU funding, is like a lot of other things in life, maybe there needs to be much more government programs and advertising and education about this as an issue and how it can affect people personally and as well as organisations.
Yeah, and Richard, I just want to come to you finally on that exact point, because I think everybody in this room has probably sat through some form of, whether it's a presentation or a quiz or something that you have to do to tick the box saying, I did good at cybersecurity. But it needs to go a little bit deeper than that. And the HSE attack, although it was awful, it was great because it was a real life example that people were impacted by. How do we get ahead of this so that we don't have to have another thing that every citizen is impacted before they fully get it?
That's a really good question. The simple answer is, and I'm copying wholesale from our colleagues in the US on this one, what we do operates in two timescales in the NCSC. The first one, we defend today. And that is, we do the short-term reactive, we take information from incidents, we feed it back out to people, we make sure people understand through our constituent base, 200-odd national security entities, that they understand what the risks are today. That's a short-term thing. We do public information campaigns, we've one running now. We do work with the telcos, there's a meeting happening now with Minister Smith, with the Gardaí and the telcos on nuisance communications, those text messages you get with the links, etc. This is all stuff we're doing today. But at the same time, we also have to try and build a more secure tomorrow. The infrastructure, the services, the IT platforms, the software we use are all vulnerable to some extent. We have to find ways to make them less vulnerable now and in the future. We have to try and find ways of building more secure infrastructure across critical infrastructure and services. We have to try and build more resilient platforms that all of these services will sit on in cloud and elsewhere. And that's what we're doing through the various different EU methodologies we've seen before, and also national things like the Nuisance Communications Forum, like the legislation we have in train right now, like the work we're doing on the National Coordination Centre in the NCSC, which will be involved in providing EU funding to the cybersecurity industry. I'll just put that one out there for everybody. And also the work we're doing in terms of certification. We have a new certification unit which was established over the summer, which will be playing a part in building certification systems at a European level and certifying them locally across a variety of different security levels. So providing national security certification at the very highest level down to lower level certifications for companies and businesses. So that's the simple answer. We defend today and we try and build a more secure tomorrow.
Okay, well, that is a hopeful note to leave things on. A huge thanks to our panel, Michael Kelly of BT, Mary Kennedy of Arup, Katie McCarthy of Irish Water, and Richard Brown, Director of the National Cybersecurity Centre. Thank you all so much for joining us this morning.